Hello, my name is Leonard, and this is the Symantec Enterprise Vault 10 for Exchange Administration, Lesson 6, Configuring Mailbox Archiving, Provisioning, and Processing. This is the second of two lessons that deal with configuring the mailbox archiving. In Lesson 5, we went through and did an overview of the mailbox archiving process, and we started looking at the policies, specifically mailbox and desktop, for setting up mailbox archiving. This is a continuation. We're going to get into, and we introduced in Lesson 5, the concept of provisioning and provisioning groups. So we're going to talk about how those work, as well as the processes that occur when you're archiving from an Exchange mailbox. So in this particular lesson, we're going to go through and look at provisioning for Exchange mailbox archiving, how to enable your Exchange mailbox archive, and we're going to define our retention and deletion capabilities. First is looking at the provisioning for the Exchange mailbox. We're going to talk about what provisioning is, what it does for us. Provisioning is the capability of applying a certain set of archiving settings to a particular group of users or a group of users. It can be applied to a range of different targets. These can include individual users, users groups from Active Directory, both security and distribution groups. I can create my own custom lightweight directory access protocol or LDAP query. I also can space it upon a particular user being in an organizational unit, or I can set it up as simple as having a provisioning group applied to our entire Exchange organization. When we're going through and creating these provisioning groups and their memberships, we're going to specify certain properties to apply to a provisioning group. We're going to go through and look at applying both the mailbox and desktop policies that we looked at in Lesson 5. We're also going to be able to apply retention categories, and optionally we can also go through and apply a vault store to be associated with a particular vault, a particular provisioning group. So we're going to go through and look at the details of how to set this up, and this must be run. Provisioning is also what's going to enable us to find the mailboxes for enabling, and then we'll be able to enable the mailboxes for archiving, and we'll actually be up to the point to where we'll be able to start archiving our mail environment. What is the purpose of the provisioning groups? They're going to define the users, and again, we talked about users. Users are associated with a mailbox. Mailboxes are associated with an archive, so we'll kind of go together there for a particular group. We're going to apply the policies for desktop migration, PST migration, and the mailbox. We're also going to be able to set up the retention category and the vault store to associate with that particular group in the provisioning group, as well as deciding whether or not we wish to automatically enable mailboxes when new people get into our provisioning group. An overview of setting up the provisioning group includes selecting the mailboxes to be associated with the group, select the policies and the retention categories that you wish to be applied to this group. Optionally, you can select a vault store to apply to the group. Again, you don't have to select one here. It can be specified at the site level. Optionally, you can select to automatically enable the mailboxes, as well as to determine if the actual archiving process will start immediately. You can order the provisioning groups. This gets into the issue of, I may have a particular person that is in multiple provisioning groups. How are we going to decide which provisioning group actually applies, and therefore which particular mailbox, desktop policies, and so on they receive? And then we also want to be able to go back and verify the correct policy assignments based upon those provisioning groups. So starting off, we'll start off with creating the provisioning groups. To use an administrative console to add in a provisioning group, all you have to do is go down to the targets, and under your targets in your Exchange domain environment, there'll be a section labeled provisioning group. We just right-click the provisioning group and select New Provisioning Group, and a new provisioning group wizard will start up. You walk through and answer the questions associated in the new provisioning wizard group, and then you'll have a provisioning group. Now also, as we had mentioned in previous lessons, you do have the capability of configuring some of the things that we're doing through the Enterprise Vault Administration Console here in the Getting Started wizard. So you can, in fact, create provisioning groups using the Getting Started wizard. In Express mode, it only creates one provisioning group, and that one provisioning group will be assigned to the entire Exchange organization. Or you can go through, and if you select the custom option for provisioning groups, you can go through individual wizards and create as many different provisioning groups as you may need. As we mentioned, part of the provisioning group wizard will be to select the mailboxes to include in the provisioning group. You can base those upon the list here, which includes Windows groups, which are the security groups, Windows users, distribution groups, which again are still Windows groups, but they're specifically just distribution groups, organizational units, the lightweight directory access protocol queries, or the whole Exchange organization. If you are going to use a lightweight directory access protocol query, we recommend that you test that out in another environment to guarantee that your query syntax does in fact return the correct mailboxes that you're expecting. You can test that in a utility called Active Directory Users and Computers, which is part of the Active Directory infrastructure. And inside of Active Directory Users and Computers, it has a find feature, and with that find feature, you can then specify a LDAP, or Lightweight Directory Access Protocol query, test it out before you paste it into the query for your Enterprise Vault provisioning group selection. After you specified who you wish to belong in the particular group, you then go through and assign a desktop policy and a mailbox policy to the group. And then if it is applicable, you can assign a PST migration policy. We haven't looked at those yet. We have a separate lesson on PST migration, so we'll be visiting the PST migration policy in that lesson. You can also select an existing retention category. If you don't already have an existing retention category, you can in fact use the wizard to create a new retention category. If you do create the retention category from within the provisioning group wizard, that retention category will be available to anybody else that has permission to assign retention categories. Optionally, as we mentioned before, you do have the option of specifying or associating a vault store with a provisioning group. If the provisioning group is automatically enabled for archiving, the vault store will be used for any future mailboxes that are added to that particular provisioning group. And the provisioning group can inherit the settings from either the Exchange settings, and when we say Exchange settings here, we're talking about the Exchange object within the Enterprise Vault administration console. So I can set up the vault store there, or I can set it up on the individual server. So I have like 3 different places it can be configured, but I can override it in the provisioning group if I wish. And it's typically a best practice within Enterprise Vault to associate a Exchange server with a specific Enterprise Vault server. For automatically enabling mailboxes, this is a section of the wizard for creating a new provisioning group. You can see that you have a checkbox to decide whether or not you wish to enable mailboxes automatically. And if you do select the option to enable the mailboxes automatically, if you wish to initially suspend archiving. What you may decide is that you want to let the users decide when archiving starts. So initially when you're setting everything up, you do not want the archiving to take place automatically based upon the Exchange mailbox archiving task that we talked about in Lesson 5. Next thing, as we mentioned, typically what we find out is that a particular user may be in multiple Windows groups. A particular user may be in a different organizational unit than the Windows security groups they're in. So if I use these Windows security groups and organizational units to generate my provisioning groups, a user might find themselves in multiple provisioning groups. So how am I going to determine which provisioning group has priority? And then once I've decided that particular provisioning group, assign the correct policies. Well, what I set up is something called a ranking. In the Enterprise Vault Administration Console user interface, the ranking shows up with a rank of number 1 being the highest, which is why it shows up on the top of the list, and the ranks below that are lower, and they appear going down the list. So in our example here, the Leavers has a number 1 rank, and the whole organization provisioning group has the lowest rank. Now, when we're going through and actually processing this using the provisioning task, we will process the provisioning group with the highest rank first. So therefore, if I'm a member of the Leavers and the legal department, I will have the Leavers provisioning group assigned to me, which means I will get the settings associated with the Leavers provisioning group instead of getting them ones from the legal department, because the legal department is the third one. And I will only belong ultimately to one provisioning group, or will have only the settings associated with one provisioning group attached to me. I also have the option of testing this out, the ranking system. And we go back to something we looked at in Lesson 5, which is the Common Tasks Launchpad under the Mailbox Management section. And if we expand that out, we have the option to click on the Display Policies Assigned to Mailboxes. And again, you can see from the dialog box shown on the screen that you can see which mailboxes are assigned which Exchange servers, which then can relate to provisioning groups, which then relates to desktop and Exchange policies. And then just not shown in that picture, it will also show you the PST migration policies that have been assigned to you, as well as if your archive has been suspended. And it will say yes or no as to whether or not your archive has been suspended. Now, when we're creating the provisioning groups, again, you give it a name, you give it a membership, but you can go back and change the properties associated with a provisioning group. If you are going to be changing the membership or you're going to be changing the settings in a provisioning group, you do want to make sure that you go through and rerun the provisioning task and a mailbox synchronization to make sure that those new settings have been applied. In this particular example here, we're looking at the provisioning group for the marketing group. So maybe I have an organizational unit named marketing, and I've placed all the users for that particular organizational unit into this particular provisioning group. On the General tab, you can see the domain that this applies to. You can see the name of the provisioning group. You also see listed the desktop policy, mailbox policy, and PST migration policy, and we've specified and talked about those before. What we want to do in this particular screenshot is bring up the issue of the archive mailboxes in this provisioning group option. There may be times when you do not wish to have the items archived for a particular provisioning group. So we give you the capability of removing that check mark, and then you can go through and again run the provisioning task and a synchronization to verify that that setting is applied, and then everyone who belongs to this provisioning group will have their archiving stopped. Typically, you're doing this for troubleshooting or trying to figure out why certain things aren't getting archived, which again is basically troubleshooting. But once you've got everything figured out, you can come back and place the check mark back in again, run the provisioning task and a synchronization to get everything set back up, and archiving will start at the next either scheduled mailbox archiving run or if you manually run the Exchange mailbox archiving task. Some general guidelines or best practices for setting up provisioning group. For simplicity and management purposes, we recommend that you try to use as few provisioning groups as possible to try to make it less complex. Also, we want to remind you that when you do create more than one provisioning group, that you need to correctly rank them, with the most specific group being at the top, which means the smallest number of members, and the most generic or least specific at the bottom of the list. That's why we typically always have a provisioning group ranked last, whatever the highest number is, being the group that is the whole Exchange organization. So it's kind of the catch-all. If I didn't fall into one of the ones above the whole Exchange organization, for example, the one that was on the slide there, I will still get a provisioning group, which will give me my policies, which means that I can enable my mailbox and be able to archive items in there. I already mentioned testing out the lightweight directory access protocol queries before you implement them in a provisioning group. We do recommend, because the provisioning task will be verifying that the users and or groups exist before assigning them their mailbox policies and so on, and it does that lookup using the Active Directory Global Catalog. So we're not saying to assign a global catalog to a particular EV server, but when we're talking about Active Directory sites, you want to have a global catalog in the same Active Directory site as the Enterprise Vault server to try to expedite those lookups. And we also recommend specifying individual Exchange servers to specific Vault stores for organizational purposes when you're setting up the provisioning groups. So let's start looking at the details of the Exchange provisioning task. The Exchange provisioning task will run periodically based upon the schedule that you specify. By default, it is scheduled to run once a day. You can specify it to run more often by running it manually or setting up a schedule to occur more than once. When you go through and set it up, you have to have the task, and it will process all the provisioning groups to determine which provisioning groups are getting which mailbox policies, and it's going to write all those mailbox details into the mailbox. and there's a table inside of the directory database that stores all that information. It is a mandatory task. You cannot run Enterprise Vault Exchange Mailbox Archiving unless you have at least one provisioning task per domain. In our particular example that we're demonstrating in this course, we only have a single domain structure, exchange.com. But if you had a multiple Active Directory infrastructure, you would have a separate provisioning task for each domain. It's going to, for the first archiving task, it'll automatically create the first Exchange Mailbox archiving task. We'll create the first provisioning task. It'll automatically post mailbox synchronization requests for those policies that have changed. That's when you're running, basically what that's saying is that when you're running the provisioning task, at the completion, it'll fire off a synchronization. And it uses point-in-time processing, which means that it's not using a window like the mailbox archiving task was using a window to get all the archiving done. It'll just start up and run through to completion. So, and then it'll terminate the task itself. So now that we've got the provisioning group and the provisioning task running, we're now ready to go and enable the mailboxes that we wish to archive. To enable the mailboxes, you can go through a couple different ways to do that. Based upon your Exchange environment, you go through and specify from the menu, the Tools menu, and select Enable Mailboxes. Here on the slide, we've given you an example of an Exchange Administration Console toolbar and what the icon on the toolbar looks like for the opening up the Enable Mailbox wizard. Also, you can have it happen automatically. We showed you the checkbox in the provisioning group properties where you can tell it to automatically enable the mailboxes. Using a wizard, you can go through, and once the wizard starts up, as I mentioned, you can go through the Tools menu, or you can click on the toolbar to start it up. You specify the name of the Exchange server that hosts the individual mailboxes associated with this particular provisioning group that you're enabling. And then afterwards, you can go through and select the Exchange server to either view all the mailboxes, or you also have a filter built in that gives you the ability to filter based upon attributes associated with the mailbox, such as country or department. You select the mailboxes that you want to enable, and then you go ahead and tell it to enable the system. And it will go through and show you a little progress window that will show you as it's actually enabling the mailboxes. If you just want to go ahead and select all of the enabled mailboxes on that particular Exchange server, you can click a Select All button, and it does support the typical Shift Select and Control Select combinations to select groups of users from the list. This shows you the dialog box for selecting the mailboxes. So in this particular example, we have selected the mailboxes and enabled them. But as part of the wizard, it also gives you the option of changing the vault store for individual mailboxes. Now, this setting will override the vault store that was set based upon the provisioning group, as well as the retention category, assuming that they have permission to make those changes. If they don't have those permissions to make those changes, even though you change it here, it'll still go back to the default one set up based upon their mailbox archiving policy. Another thing that can be configured as part of enabling the mailboxes is billing archive usage. The idea here is that there may be some scenarios where you're going to charge people based upon the amount of storage that they're using. So you're going to be taking that storage off of those frontline servers, but you're still going to have some storage even after we go through and do our compression and our deduplication to get our single instance storage. So by default, it's going to charge that particular mailbox's primary account, which the account is associated with the mailbox. But you may find yourself in a situation, maybe you're going to just send one bill to the marketing department, one bill to the finance department. So it would make more sense to actually bill all the people in this provisioning group to the head of that particular department. So it gives you that capability. Again, if you're not using it for billing storage usage, then typically the default mailbox primary account will be fine. When the actual archiving starts as part of the enabling the mailboxes, we've given you a screenshot here. You can have it start immediately using the default archive settings. And when they say the default archive settings, that's everything that you set up in the mailbox policy, the PST migration policy, retention category, and so on for that particular provisioning group. But you also have the capability of telling the user that they can decide when they're actually going to start archiving their mailbox. If you do set it up for that particular option, the user must have the full Outlook client. If the particular Outlook client that's being used is the HTTP only client, then that user will not be able to enable their mailbox for archiving. Now, right now, the full client versus the HTTP only client probably doesn't make sense, but we do have later lessons where we'll get into the Outlook archiving client, and we will specifically explain the differences between the full client and the HTTP only client. If you did set up the provisioning group properties, for this particular example, we're looking at the laptop users group on the archiving defaults. Also, you got the option of automatically enable the mailbox, but also you've got the option to set up and initially suspend archiving. We haven't shown it anywhere, but we also have a disable mailbox wizard. So again, maybe you've enabled 10 or 15 users, and for some reason, one user is going on vacation or something, and you decide that you want to disable their mailbox. Instead of removing that check mark that says disable the archiving or results in disabling the archiving for the entire provisioning group, you can run that disable mailbox wizard to disable individual mailboxes. So that is available as an option. Now, once the mailbox has been enabled, there are certain changes that occur associated with the mailbox. One of the changes is going to be we create what's called a hidden message. This hidden message will be stored in that user's inbox. They never see this hidden message unless they use some Enterprise Vault client-sized tools. And when we get to the troubleshooting lesson, we will show you what it looks like to see the information about the hidden message using those client-side tools. But this message will just store the various desktop settings specified by the desktop policy. Also, it will specify the uniform resource locator or URL for your Enterprise Vault web access application. So if you're using the browser search or Archive Explorer, you'll be able to access that. And also, it will enable a welcome message environment so that that user will receive a welcome message if you have configured and set that up. This is an example of the welcome message. By default, the welcome message isn't in the default location because we don't know exactly what you want in the welcome message. Also, we don't know what language you're going to be supporting. So in the topmost picture there, or screenshot, we have the hierarchy of the installation folders for Enterprise Vault. So at the very top, you can see the Enterprise Vault folder. We navigate down to a subfolder named Languages, and then we go to a subfolder named Mailbox Messages. We then use a two-letter abbreviation to represent the individual languages, and for this particular class, we've chosen EN for English. Once we have selected the EN for language, we can then go up and select the different mailbox messages that are available, and you can see we're going to specifically address the enable mailbox message. But also notice right above the enable mailbox message there is a disable mailbox message as well, which you can configure. So there's like 3 or 4 messages that can be configured. We're trying to configure the welcome message, which is named enable mailbox message. Now, what you typically want to do with this particular message is to make a copy of it. You're going to take that copy and move it to the Enterprise Vault folder. So you move it from way down there in the languages, two-letter abbreviation folder, all the way up to the Enterprise Vault folder, and then you're going to edit it. When you first open it up, as you can see there on the second screenshot, it has a bunch of red text inside of the message. It's going to give you instructions on what you want to do. So you can go through and you can add a link to the welcome message. A link to the client software installation folder. We'll come back and revisit that later. You can give them instructions on what Enterprise Vault's bringing to them, how to use it, but all that stuff can be included in that welcoming message. Some best practices for enabling your mailboxes. Again, make sure that you have the right people in the right provisioning groups. Make sure that you follow the provisioning groups and provisioning tasks best practices. Make sure you have it related to the correct Enterprise Vault server, the correct storage service. And the reason why we bring up the correct storage service is that, again, we can split out indexing and storage on different servers. So we have that capability, so make sure everything's lined up with the correct storage service. Also, to try to ensure that you have a one-to-many relationship between your Enterprise Vault servers and your Exchange server. What that's basically saying is that I might have one Enterprise Vault server to 3 or 4 Exchange servers. Also, you want to make sure that you associate Exchange servers with a specific Vault store on the Enterprise Vault servers. that are local on the network. And when we say local on the network, from an Active Directory standpoint, that means within the same Active Directory site. Also, you do have the option, though, for the individual Exchange servers. In this case here, we're talking about the Exchange server properties within the Enterprise Vault Administration Console as to whether or not you wish to override the inherited Vault store. So this gives you the option of overriding the site settings for the Vault store that's going to be used for that particular provisioning group. And then you can run the Exchange mailbox archiving task. So we finally got everything set up, the mailboxes are enabled, and we're finally ready to actually start archiving mail messages. Now, when you go through and do it again, we talked about the fact that you can set this up based upon a schedule and how to set up that site schedule for doing that. You also have the capability of running it in various modes when you do use the site schedule, such as either archiving or report mode. You also have the option of being able to run it manually. When you run it manually, you just right-click on the specific Exchange mailbox archiving task that you're trying to run. It'll bring up this Run Now dialog box that you see on the screen. With the Run Now dialog box, you have the option of specifying the run mode. There's 4 different run modes. There's archiving and shortcut processing, archiving, shortcut processing, and report mode. I'm going to talk about them a little bit differently than the order that they show up there on the screen. I'm going to start off with archiving. If you select archiving, the task archives the eligible items from the mailbox that it processes. It does not update any of the location or retention categories of any archived items or delete any shortcuts. And when it talks about the archived items there, it's talking about the shortcuts to the archived items. For the shortcut processing by itself, it's going to, based upon the settings in the Exchange mailbox policy, update the location of the archived items in the archive if their shortcuts have been moved or copied to a different location. It's also going to update the retention categories of the archived items if they have changed. It's going to delete old shortcuts, delete shortcuts to items that have been deleted by storage expiry. Those were those orphan shortcuts we talked about. It's also going to do all these types of things based upon the settings in the Exchange mailbox policy. Now, archiving and shortcut processing, as its name implies, does both the archiving piece and the shortcut processing piece. And then our last option is the report mode. And if you run it in report mode, it doesn't actually archive anything. What it does for you is it goes ahead and generates a report on what would have been archived if the Exchange mailbox archiving task had actually run. And it stores that in a reports folder under the Enterprise Vault installation folder. And there'll be a folder down there called Exchange mailbox archiving. And you can go in there and look at those particular reports. Also, on this particular item, when you are selecting the run mode, you can specify the number of the eligible items. You can have it archive all the items in a mailbox, or you can select a certain number. Also, you can specify whether or not you wish to mailbox all or archive all of the enabled mailboxes, or you can pick a specific mailbox to run it on as well. We were talking about the Exchange synchronization process. The idea of the Exchange synchronization process is to establish communication between our Enterprise Vault environment and our Exchange environment to make sure that they have the same desktop settings and all those types of things configured. So what the mailbox synchronization is actually doing is it's going to update the hidden message on the mailbox. It will notify the Enterprise Vault server of all the available mailboxes in Exchange. And if there's been any permissions changed in your Outlook folders, it will synchronize those. It runs automatically at midnight and midday, and you can run it manually by opening up the properties of the task, going to the Synchronize tab, and then click the Synchronize button. If you did, we mentioned earlier, run it in report mode. The default location for the reports is under the Enterprise Vault installation directory, Reports and Exchange Mailbox Archiving. The name of all the files there will start off with EV_archiving, and then it'll be underscore and the name of the Exchange server where that mailbox lives, and then it'll be an underscore date timestamp configuration for all those items. The reports are in a tab delimited format, which means you can open them up in any text editor such as Notepad, but it might be more beneficial to open it up in a spreadsheet type of an application to make it easier to read if you wish. So now we've gone through and basically looked at, in the previous lesson 5, setting up the mailbox archiving task, creating those mailbox and desktop policies. Moving into lesson 6, we looked at the provisioning group, setting up the provisioning task, and going through and looking at enabling mailboxes. The last thing that we want to look at in this particular lesson And this group of lessons that deal with the Exchange mailbox archiving is looking at retention and deletion. So we're going to go through and figure out how we configure the retention period as well as determining when items are going to be deleted. First, how long are the archived items being retained? We're looking at a particular retention category's properties. At the top of the retention category, you see we specify a name and a description. We also specify a retention period. So this particular one is set for 3 years. Also, you have some certain settings that you can configure. You can select a setting that prevents the deletions of archived items that have this particular retention category associated with them. And this gives you the ability to prevent users from deleting items and even expiry from deleting items as well if you decide you want to for a particular retention category. You can hide this category from your users. For example, if you don't want the users to be able to pick this retention category, but you're going to assign it to particular provisioning groups, you can hide it from them. Also, you have the capability of locking this retention category. If you lock the retention category, the idea is to prevent you from accidentally modifying it. Maybe you open the property page and it was set to 3 years, but you accidentally clicked on that box and changed it to 4, but you didn't mean to. If you had it locked, you wouldn't be able to do that. Also notice that you have the properties of basing the expiry on, and you can inherit that from the site settings, or you can set it here. And then you also can make additional administrative notes to help you maybe understand why you pick particular settings for this particular retention category. To create the retention category itself, you just go down through the directory, the Vault site, and then it's under the policies. And then it has its own little separate category. It doesn't fall under a type of frontline storage such as Exchange, Domino, or File, but it has its own little section called Retention Categories. We can just right-click and select New Retention Category, and it will open up the property page where we can go through and specify the settings that we saw on the previous screen. Now, the next thing that you can do is you can go to the site and set up what default retention category you want for all the items in a site. And again, they can be overridden by settings at different levels. But this is looking at our site property dialog box for EV Site 1. And on the Archive Settings tab is where you specify what you want to have for the default retention category for your entire site. Now, just because I've assigned a retention category doesn't mean things are deleted. So when do the items actually get deleted? Well, one could be based upon storage expiry. And storage expiry is going to look at that retention category that we've assigned and determine based upon a couple different variables when to actually delete the items. We can have users manually delete the items, but only if the administrator has allowed them to be able to do that. And also, when the administrator allows them to be able to delete items, we'll see that the administrator can also allow the administrator to recover those deleted items. There isn't any user ability to recover those deleted items if the shortcut has been deleted as well. And then manually they can be deleted by the administrators. So to kind of give us a big picture about how this is set up and working, we're going to go through and look at storage expiry in conjunction with retention periods to automatically delete items. So I'm going to start off and look at first two different dates on which I can base expiry. I can base it upon the modified date. Now the modified date is the tricky one because the modified date is going to be based for an email message based upon whether the message was sent from the sender's mailbox or when that message was received on the receiving mailbox. However, if there was a file in there, all the files have an attribute which is the last modified date. So we'll use the file's last modified date. But based upon what the modified date is, you can set up the expiry. You can also set up the expiry based upon the archive date. Now that one's pretty straightforward. That's when I went to store it in the actual archive, whether I did it automatically or I did it manually. We're going to, in our particular example, have two different items, A and B. These two different items are going to have the same retention category, all right? But they're going to be getting their expiry with different starting points. So we're going to start off with item number B down here at the bottom. And its retention category says, or I'm sorry, its expiry says that it's going to be based upon the modified date. So as soon as that particular item's modified date looks at the retention category 1 year from the modified date, it's now been expired. It's now available for deletion. However, item A was set up so that its expiry didn't start until we got to the archive date. So I have that period of time between when it was last modified to when it was archived. Then the retention category of 1 year kicks in, and now 1 year from that archive date, that item will be marked as expired, which means it can now be deleted. Where do I configure storage expiry? I can configure the storage expiry at the site level. So again, we're looking at the EV Site 1 property page, the storage expiry tab. You can specify the expiry, as you can see at the top section there, to be either based upon the modified date or the archive date. And then also you can specify when you want the storage expiry to actually process the vault stores. You can have it set up to never, which basically means the items will never be automatically deleted, or you can base it upon the selected times. Once again, in the little calendar there at the bottom, everything highlighted in blue is the selected time that you wish the expiry to run. Also note that you do have an option to run the expiry right now by clicking on the Run Now button. Also, if you're testing expiry, you don't want to automatically delete things, but you'd like to kind of keep track of the things that would be deleted if you did have expiry running, you can have it run in report mode. And you also have the option, like we had with the site schedule, of the 1 hour and the 15-minute increments for determining how precise you need to be when you're configuring the schedule for the expiry to run. Now, the actual deletion itself is under the ARC, or the site properties, for configuring whether or not users are allowed to delete items and whether or not they're allowed to recover them. So here we're still in our site properties dialog box for EV Site 1, and you see that there's an option or a checkbox for users can delete items from their archive. If that's checked, the user can actually delete the items. If they do delete the items, however, there's no easy way for them to recover them, especially if they choose to delete both the shortcut and the archived item. So therefore, we want to decide whether or not we want to give them that safety net, if you will, and allow an administrator to recover those items for it. So if you place a check mark in the option for the enable recovery of user deleted items, you can then specify how long you want to allow that administrator to be able to recover those deleted items. This is typically called a soft deletion. There's a couple restrictions. One, it can only be done by an administrator. And two, it can only recover all of the deleted items. It can't recover an individual deleted item. So how do I go about doing this? Well, I go to the individual archive. And in this particular case here, we're looking at the properties of the archive for Parveen Khan. She has deleted 11 items and decided that it was an oops and she really didn't want to delete one of those items. So because we were nice and we set up soft deletions, you can see that on the deleted items tab of Parveen Khan's archive properties, it shows you the 11 items and it gives me the option to recover the items. When I click on the recover items dialog box, the little trash can in the folder comes up and the status is shown by the little files flying from the trash can to the folder. And when it's all done, the count for items marked for deletion goes to 0, and you know that Parveen should be able to go to the mailbox and see those deleted items restored to her mailbox. Next thing we want to look at as far as deleting items is that can you, if you need to, delete an entire archive? And the answer is yes, you can. However, you need to take some things into consideration if you're going to do that. One, the archive must be either available or closed. Once you've deleted that archive, it will be marked as marked for deletion. It doesn't mean it's instantaneously going to disappear. There's some processes that need to run in the background to actually get rid of the files from the Vault Store partition location. Deleting the archives can be done either by the Vault administration the Vault service account, or a role that has that delete permission. And by default, the only role that has that delete archive permission is the Power Administrator role. Now, once you've deleted it, and once it's actually cleaned out of your system, there's no mechanism within the Enterprise Vault Administration Console to restore it. Now again, hopefully you've learned from your restoring and backup lesson, which we'll talk about later, and you can recover it from a backup if you have to. So again, seriously consider whether or not you actually need to delete an archive before you delete it. Next thing that comes up periodically is that, for legal reasons, I may need to keep a particular item around forever because I don't know when the legal case is going to be up. So one of the things that you can configure in the retention category is the ability to retain items forever. And it effectively sets the retention category to a mere 999,999 years. So that's close enough to forever for me. Now, if you do go through and select that, when the user goes through and we've changed here to a different tab, the advanced tab for the archive properties, that if you want to have these status expiry turned on and you have the check mark delete expired items from this archive automatically, that retain items forever retention category setting will override that. Now, this seems a little bit, if you will, archaic, a little bit maybe clumsy way to do it. There are better ways to do that. We talked about in the introduction lesson an add-on called the Discovery Accelerator. The Discovery Accelerator has a functionality called Legal Hold, and it only places the items that are in that particular case on hold. So it doesn't have to basically place everything in an archive effectively on hold. But again, if you don't have that type of an add-on, this is kind of a workaround for that situation. Now, the next thing we're looking at here is kind of some questions that you probably should have asked yourself up front, and that is when you're setting up the mailbox archiving starting way back in Lesson 5. What message classes did you need to have archived? Do you need or want shortcuts in your Outlook environment? Are there any mailbox quotas which may map themselves into archive quotas? How long do you want to retain these particular items? Do you want the users to have the ability to delete and recover items by the administrator or have the administrator recover them? Do you want to have automatic shortcut deletion? And do you want to run automatic shortcut expiry? Now again, all these questions hopefully have been answered for you through Lessons 5 and 6, but these are the kind of questions you want to ask when you're setting up your mailbox archiving, going all the way from the Exchange mailbox archiving, or Exchange mailbox policy, all the way through the provisioning groups, provisioning tasks, right into deletion and retention categories and expiry. So in this particular lesson, we learned how to use the Enterprise Vault provisioning. We also learned how to enable mailboxes for archiving. We also learned how to define retention and deletion settings. For our reference materials, that includes the Administrative Console Help, the Introduction and Planning Guide, the Installing and Configuring Guide, our Setting Up the Exchange Server Archiving, and Administrator's Guide. And this brings us to the end of lesson number 6.